"Sit in the back, Dad. Do not make this about you." Those were the first words my daughter said to me that morning. And for a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard her, because there are sentences you expect from strangers, maybe even from enemies, but not from the person you once carried on your shoulders through grocery store aisles when she was too tired to walk, not from the little girl who used to fall asleep holding your thumb like it was the only stable thing in her world. And yet there she was, Lauren, standing in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my first car, her voice low but sharp enough to cut clean through the quiet hum of the church, her eyes not angry, not even emotional, just calculated, like she was managing a situation rather than speaking to her father. And I stood there at the entrance of St. Mark's, holding a small gift bag that suddenly felt heavier than it should have, watching guests file past me in tailored suits and polished shoes, people from Brian's side of the family mostly, people who nodded politely but did not recognize me, did not know that I had spent the last 10 years quietly wiring money into accounts that made this entire event possible. And Lauren stepped slightly to the side, not to let me in, but to redirect me, her hand gesturing toward the back rows where a cluster of folding chairs had been set up near the exit, chairs without name cards, without programs, as if they were reserved for whoever did not quite belong. And I followed her gaze, then looked back at her, waiting, just for a second, for something to break in her expression, some flicker of hesitation, some sign that this was a misunderstanding. But there was nothing. Only that same calm, rehearsed composure. And behind her, Brian stood near the front, one hand resting casually on the back of a pew, speaking with the priest as if he had always belonged there, as if this church, this ceremony, this entire narrative had been built around him. And I noticed something small then, something that would not have meant anything to anyone else. But to me it landed with a quiet weight. There was a name card on the front row that read, Whitaker family, but it was placed beneath Brian's parents, not me, and I felt that shift, not sudden, not explosive, but slow and precise, like a piece of glass sliding into place, separating what I had believed from what was actually in front of me. And I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I understood something in that moment that I had been refusing to see for years, and I walked toward the back, my shoes making a soft echo against the polished floor, the sound oddly loud in the silence. And as I sat down on that folding chair, I ran my fingers along the edge of the gift bag, feeling the crisp paper inside, the envelope, the one thing no one here knew about yet. And I kept my face still, my posture straight, my breathing even, because if there is one thing I learned after a lifetime of building things from nothing, it is that you do not react when the foundation shifts. You observe, you measure, and you wait. And as the organ began to play and the ceremony prepared to start, I looked up at the front of the church where my daughter stood with her new family. And for the first time, I realized they were not asking me to sit in the back. They had already decided I did not belong in the picture at all, and the silence inside me did not feel like defeat. It felt like clarity. The folding chair creaked slightly under my weight, a small, hollow sound that seemed louder than it should have in a room designed for reverence. And I noticed how different the air felt back here. Thinner somehow, like even the warmth of the ceremony did not quite reach this corner. And from where I sat I could see everything without being seen, which, I realized, was exactly where they wanted me, and exactly where I had unknowingly positioned myself in their lives for years, quietly present, financially essential, but visually optional. And as the organ notes settled into a steady rhythm, people began to turn their attention forward, their bodies angling toward the altar, toward Brian, toward Lauren, toward the version of this family they were presenting to the world. And I followed their gaze, not with resentment, but with a kind of measured curiosity, the same way I used to study blueprints for structural weaknesses, because once you know where to look, flaws stop hiding, and they begin to reveal themselves in the smallest details, like the way Brian adjusted his cufflinks before shaking hands with the priest. A subtle gesture that said he was used to being observed, used to being in control, and the way Lauren leaned slightly toward him, her posture mirroring his without thinking, as if she had aligned herself to his axis completely. And I wondered, not for the first time, when that shift had happened, when my daughter had stopped standing beside me and started standing behind someone else, and a memory surfaced, uninvited but precise, of a late night 10 years ago when she called me from a small apartment with peeling paint and a broken heater, her voice, shaking as she told me she did not know how she was going to make rent, and I had wired the money before she finished the sentence. No questions, no conditions, just a quiet transfer that kept her life moving forward. And there had been dozens of moments like that. Invisible transactions that built a foundation no one ever acknowledged. And now I sat in a folding chair near an exit sign that flickered faintly, watching the result of all that support being carefully edited into a narrative that no longer included me. And I let that thought settle without reacting, because reaction would have been easy, expected even, but observation was more useful. And that was when I noticed the usher, a young man in a dark suit with a name tag slightly crooked on his lapel, making his way down the aisle toward me, his steps hesitant but deliberate. And when he reached my row, he leaned in just enough to keep his voice low, his tone respectful in a way that did not match the role I had been assigned. And he said, "Sir, I just wanted to confirm, you are Mr. Whitaker, correct?" And I looked at him for a moment, not because I was confused, but because I was measuring the weight of that recognition, and I nodded once, and he glanced toward the front before continuing. "There was a note in the event file about a primary sponsor, and I wanted to make sure we had your seating correct." And the phrasing was careful, but the implication was not, and I felt something shift again, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, like a calculation updating with new data. And I gave him a small, polite smile, the kind you give when you are acknowledging information without confirming it. And I said, "You have it exactly as they intended." And he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, as if he sensed the gap between intention and accuracy. But then he straightened and nodded, stepping back into his role, moving on to the next row. And I watched him go, then returned my attention to the front where the ceremony was beginning. The priest speaking about family, about legacy, about the responsibilities that come with bringing a new life into the world. And the words carried easily across the room, landing softly on every polished surface, every attentive face, including mine. And I found it interesting how language could sound so complete while meaning so little when the structure behind it was misaligned. And as I listened, I slipped my hand into the inside pocket of my jacket and felt the edge of the envelope again. The paper firm and precise, containing documents that had taken months to finalize, signatures, clauses, conditions that had been designed not out of control, but out of protection. A $2 million education fund for Ethan, structured to ensure stability, opportunity, a future that would not depend on the shifting loyalties of adults who might forget what family is supposed to mean. And I had planned to present it quietly, privately, after the ceremony, a gesture of continuity, of support. But sitting there in the back, watching the front row filled with people who believed they were the center of this story, I realized something with a clarity that felt almost surgical. This was not about where I was sitting. It was about how I was being defined, and definitions, once accepted, have a way of becoming permanent, unless you change the terms yourself. And I kept my expression neutral, my posture steady, as the ceremony moved forward, because there was still time, and more importantly, there was still a sequence to follow. And I had learned a long time ago that timing is not about reacting to the moment. It is about choosing the moment that matters most. The priest's voice carried a steady cadence, measured and warm, speaking about responsibility, about the sacred duty of guiding a child into a world that does not always reward kindness. And I watched as Brian stepped forward with practiced ease, one hand lightly resting on the back of the pew as if it were a stage marker he had rehearsed hitting, and Lauren followed half a step behind, her expression composed, her smile calibrated for the audience rather than the moment. And I noticed how naturally they occupied the space at the front, how seamlessly they fit into the image being presented. And it occurred to me that presentation had become more important than truth somewhere along the way, because truth is often quiet, unpolished, inconvenient, while presentation is clean, controlled, and easily consumed. And I sat there, letting that distinction settle into place, not as a complaint, but as a realization that clarified everything that had felt off for years. And then Brian began speaking, his voice confident, projecting just enough to reach the back rows without sounding forced, thanking everyone for coming, acknowledging his parents by name, even pausing to gesture toward them with a small smile that drew a ripple of approving laughter from the front section. And I followed his gesture, noting the way their heads lifted slightly, how they leaned into the recognition as if it were something they had earned rather than inherited. And then he continued, speaking about family, about support, about the importance of building a strong foundation for the next generation, and the irony of that word did not escape me. Foundation, because I have spent my entire life understanding what it takes to build one that actually holds, one that does not crack under pressure or shift when weight is applied unevenly. And I found myself studying his words the same way I would study a structure, looking for load points, for stress lines, for anything that suggested this was more performance than substance. And then Lauren stepped closer to him, placing her hand lightly on his arm, and I saw the photographer adjust position to capture the angle, the light catching her ring, the symmetry of the moment carefully framed, and I realized that even the intimacy of a family ritual, had been choreographed down to the smallest detail. And I wondered where spontaneity had gone, where sincerity had been replaced by alignment, with an image that required constant maintenance. And then there was a pause, a subtle shift in the rhythm, and Brian glanced toward the priest before continuing, his tone lowering slightly, as if he were about to share something more personal. And he said, "We have been incredibly blessed with support from those who believe in our vision for Ethan's future." And the phrasing caught my attention immediately, not because of what it included, but because of what it excluded. There were no names, no specifics, just a general acknowledgement that allowed the audience to assume whatever fit the narrative best. And I felt that quiet click again, the same internal adjustment that happens when a measurement confirms what you suspected but had not yet proven. And I looked down at my hands, steady, still, resting on my lap. And for a brief moment, another memory surfaced, not dramatic, not loud, but precise, of a bank manager sitting across from me months ago, sliding a set of documents forward, explaining the structure of the trust, the clauses designed to protect the principal, the conditions tied not to control, but to behavior, to the idea that support should reinforce responsibility, not replace it. And I remembered signing those documents with the same pen I have carried for decades, the weight of it familiar, grounding, a reminder that decisions like that are not about emotion, they are about clarity. And as I sat there now, listening to Brian speak about support in abstract terms, I realized that abstraction is convenient when specifics do not serve your narrative, and I felt no anger, no surge of resentment, just a calm, almost detached understanding that what I was witnessing was not a mistake. It was a choice, repeated enough times to become a pattern, and patterns, once identified, can be addressed. And then I noticed something else, something small but telling. Lauren did not look toward the back even once. Not when Brian spoke, not when the congregation responded, not when the priest invited the family to step forward. Her focus remained entirely on the front, on the image, on the alignment she had chosen, and that absence, that deliberate omission of even a glance, carried more weight than any words she could have said, because it confirmed what the seating arrangement had already suggested. This was not about logistics. It was about positioning, and I sat there, absorbing that without resistance. Because resistance would have been a reaction to something already decided, and I was no longer interested in reacting. I was interested in understanding, and more importantly, in choosing how I would respond when the moment required it. And as the ceremony moved toward its central ritual, the priest inviting them closer, the room leaning in with quiet anticipation, I adjusted slightly in my chair, the envelope in my pocket pressing gently against my side, a physical reminder of what still existed outside the frame of this presentation. And I realized that while they had carefully arranged who was visible, they had overlooked something fundamental. Visibility does not determine reality, and the most significant elements of any structure are often the ones you do not see until they are removed. The moment came quietly, almost gently, the kind of moment that would not register to anyone who was not paying attention, and yet it carried more weight than anything that had been said so far. Because as the priest invited the parents forward to present Ethan, there was a subtle shift in the arrangement at the front, a small reconfiguration of space that revealed intention more clearly than any words could. And I watched as Brian's mother stepped closer, positioning herself just within the frame of the moment, her hand resting lightly on Lauren's shoulder as if to anchor her there, while Brian adjusted his stance to face the congregation fully, ensuring the symmetry remained intact. And I noticed how natural it all looked, how effortless. as if this configuration had always existed, as if there had never been any other version of this family. And I felt that quiet clarity deepen, not sharper, not harsher, just more defined, like a lens coming into focus. And I let my gaze move across the front row again, across the polished shoes, the carefully chosen fabrics, the subtle nods exchanged between people who understood their roles in this presentation, and then I let it drift back to Lauren, watching her profile as she looked toward the priest, her expression serene, controlled, and I searched, not for emotion, but for recognition, for any indication that she was aware of the absence she had created, but there was nothing, not even a flicker, and that absence told me more than any confrontation ever could, because it confirmed that this was not a lapse in judgment. It was a settled position, and I sat with that realization without resistance, allowing it to settle fully before I did anything with it. Because reacting too early would have been like adjusting a structure before understanding where the load truly rested. And I had learned that patience, in moments like this, is not weakness, it is precision. And then something small broke the pattern, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to register if you were watching closely. The priest paused, his eyes moving briefly across the room as if checking for someone. And for a fraction of a second, his gaze landed near the back where I sat, not directly on me, but close enough to suggest that there had been an expectation, a placement that did not match what he was seeing, and that pause lingered just long enough to create a hairline fracture in the seamless flow of the ceremony. And I saw Brian notice it, just a slight tightening at the corner of his mouth, a micro-adjustment as he stepped half an inch closer to center, reclaiming control of the frame, and Lauren followed instinctively, her posture aligning again, smoothing over the disruption before it could become visible to anyone else. And the moment passed, absorbed into the larger narrative without comment. But I had seen it, and more importantly, I understood what it meant. There had been an original plan, a structure that included me in a different position, one that had been altered, intentionally, to fit a revised image, and that alteration had not been communicated to everyone involved, which meant there were inconsistencies beneath the surface, and inconsistencies, when left unaddressed, tend to compound. And I felt a quiet acknowledgement of that fact settle into place, not as a threat, but as a simple truth about how systems behave. And as the priest resumed, guiding them through the ritual, speaking the words that would mark this moment as official, as meaningful, I reached into my jacket again, this time not just to feel the envelope, but to adjust it slightly, aligning the edges, ensuring it sat exactly where I wanted it, because I understood now that what I had planned to do quietly, privately, would need to be reconsidered, not out of spite, not as a reaction to being placed in the back, but because the context had changed. The definition of family being presented here did not match the one that had guided my decisions, and continuing under the original assumptions would have been a failure of clarity on my part, and I have never believed in building on assumptions that no longer hold. And as I made that small adjustment, I noticed another detail. The photographer had shifted position again, angling to capture the moment from slightly higher, ensuring that the front rows filled the frame completely, cropping out the back almost entirely. And I almost smiled at the precision of it, because it mirrored exactly what was happening in a broader sense. The visible narrative was being carefully constructed, while everything that did not fit was simply excluded, not erased, not confronted, just left outside the frame. And I sat there, fully aware now of my position both physically and symbolically. And I felt no urgency, no need to correct anything in that moment. Because correction requires engagement, and engagement requires acknowledgement, and neither had been offered. And as the ceremony reached its quiet peak, the priest lifting his hand, the congregation leaning in with collective attention, I understood with complete certainty that the most important decision I would make today would not happen at the front of this church. It would happen after, in the space between what they believed to be true and what actually was. And I was content to let that gap widen just a little more before I stepped into it. The water touched Ethan's forehead with a soft, almost delicate finality, the kind of gesture that carried centuries of meaning while lasting only a few seconds, and the congregation responded exactly as expected, a gentle murmur, a collective release of held breath, a quiet acknowledgement that the central moment had been completed, and I watched as Brian exhaled slightly, his shoulders loosening just enough to suggest relief, not emotional relief, but the satisfaction of execution, as if a critical step in a carefully managed process had gone according to plan, and Lauren mirrored that shift again, her smile widening just a fraction, her posture relaxing as she turned slightly toward the nearest guests, already transitioning from ceremony to reception, from ritual to presentation, and I remained where I was, my hands still, my expression unchanged, allowing the moment to pass without inserting myself into it. Because insertion, at this stage, would have been misaligned with what I had come to understand, and understanding, once fully formed, demands a different kind of response, one that is not reactive, but deliberate. And as people began to stand, the soft shuffle of shoes against polished wood filling the space, I noticed how quickly the room reorganized itself, how conversations sparked in small clusters, how attention shifted away from the altar and toward each other, toward networking, toward reinforcement of relationships that extended beyond this event. And I saw Brian's father step forward to greet a man in a Navy suit, their handshake firm, their smiles practiced, and I saw Lauren being drawn into a circle of women, their voices light, their laughter controlled, each interaction reinforcing the image that had been presented at the front, and I remained outside those circles, not excluded in a way that required acknowledgement, but simply not included, which is often more telling. And I let that observation settle without resistance, because by now it was no longer surprising. It was consistent, and consistency, even when unpleasant, has a certain clarity to it. And as I rose from the folding chair, I felt the slight stiffness in my knees, a reminder of years that had been spent building, providing, supporting, years that had left their mark not just financially, but physically. And I adjusted my jacket, smoothing the fabric with a small, habitual motion, the envelope inside shifting slightly against my chest, and I took a moment, just a brief pause, to consider the sequence that had led here, not in a nostalgic way, not revisiting every detail, but in a focused, structured manner, like reviewing a set of calculations before making a final decision. And I saw clearly the pattern that had been forming for years, the gradual shift from reliance to entitlement, from gratitude to assumption, from partnership to positioning. And I recognized that what had happened this morning was not an isolated incident. It was simply the most visible expression of a pattern that had gone unaddressed for too long, and I accepted my part in that, not as blame, but as responsibility, because systems evolve based on what they are allowed to become, and I had allowed this one to develop without correction, believing that stability would be enough, that consistent support would reinforce connection, and I understood now that support without boundaries does not create strength, it creates dependency, and dependency, when combined with ambition, often transforms into something else entirely. And as I stepped into the aisle, moving toward the exit, I noticed the usher again, standing near the doorway, his posture attentive, his eyes scanning the room with the same quiet diligence as before, and when he saw me approach, he offered a small nod, respectful, not performative, just an acknowledgement that felt grounded in something more genuine than what I had observed at the front, and I returned it with a slight inclination of my head, a silent exchange that required no elaboration. And then I stepped out into the foyer, where the light shifted, softer, less curated, the sound of the ceremony fading behind me, replaced by the muted hum of conversation from the reception area beyond. And I paused there, not because I was uncertain, but because this was the point, where intention transitions into action, where decisions move from internal to external, and I reached into my pocket, this time fully removing the envelope, holding it in my hand, feeling the weight of it, not just the paper, but the implications contained within it, the structure, the conditions, the future it represented, and I looked at it for a moment, not with hesitation, but with clarity, because clarity had been earned, not given. And I understood now that what I did next would not be about correcting a slight or responding to a moment of disrespect. It would be about realigning a system that had drifted too far from its intended purpose. And I slid the envelope back into my jacket, adjusting it once more so it sat exactly where I wanted it. Because timing, as I had reminded myself earlier, is not about reacting to the moment. It is about choosing the moment that matters most. And as I stepped forward, moving toward the reception where the real interactions would take place, I knew that moment was approaching, and when it arrived, it would not be loud, it would not be dramatic, but it would be precise, and it would be final in a way that no one in that room was currently prepared to understand. The reception room was brighter, louder, filled with the kind of polished energy that comes from people who know they are being seen, and as I stepped inside, I could feel the shift immediately, the transition from quiet ceremony to controlled celebration, where every interaction carried a subtle purpose, every smile served a function, and I moved along the edge of the room rather than through its center, not out of hesitation, but out of preference, because observation is always clearer from the perimeter, and from there I could see how the space had been arranged, tall cocktail tables positioned to encourage small, contained conversations, a long buffet set along the far wall, and at the center, a cluster forming around Brian and Lauren, the focal point of the room, exactly as intended, and I watched as guests approached them one by one, offering congratulations, compliments, affirmations that reinforced the image they had presented earlier, and Brian received it all with ease. His posture relaxed, his responses measured, while Lauren mirrored him again, her laughter timed, her expressions aligned, and I noticed how seamlessly they operated as a unit, how consistent the presentation remained regardless of who stepped into their orbit, and I understood that this consistency had been built intentionally, reinforced over time, and protected carefully. And I also understood that anything that did not align with it would be quietly redirected, just as I had been earlier. And I accepted that without resistance, because resistance would have been a reaction to a system that was functioning exactly as it had been designed, and instead, I focused on what mattered next, the sequence, the timing, the point at which intention would transition into action, and I made my way slowly toward a small table near the side of the room, setting the gift bag down with deliberate care, not as a signal, not as an announcement, but simply as a placement, a marker that I could return to, and then I turned slightly, positioning myself where I could see both the entrance and the central cluster, maintaining that same quiet awareness I had carried through the ceremony. And it was there that I noticed him, standing near the bar, speaking briefly with one of the event staff, a man in his late 50s, composed, understated, his presence not drawing attention, but holding it once recognized. And even from a distance, there was a familiarity in the way he carried himself, the kind of precision that comes from years of managing details that most people never see. And I knew without needing confirmation that this was Daniel Reeves, the attorney who had finalized the trust documents with me months ago, and his presence here, unannounced, unacknowledged by the family at the center of the room, confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that there were elements in motion beyond what was visible. And I watched as he finished his brief exchange and stepped slightly away from the bar, his eyes scanning the room once, not searching, but locating, and when they settled on me, there was no surprise, no hesitation, just a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement that required no introduction, and I returned it in kind, equally subtle, equally controlled, because this was not a moment for display. It was a moment for alignment, and I let a few seconds pass before moving toward him, not directly, but along a path that appeared incidental, stopping once to adjust my jacket, once to pick up a glass of water from a passing tray, maintaining the rhythm of someone simply navigating a crowded room. And when I reached his side, we did not shake hands immediately, we did not draw attention to the connection. Instead, we stood for a brief moment as if sharing the same space by coincidence, and then he spoke. His voice low, measured. "Mr. Whitaker." I trust the ceremony proceeded as expected, and the phrasing was precise, not asking how I felt, not commenting on what had occurred, simply confirming the sequence, and I allowed a small pause before responding, not out of uncertainty, but to ensure that what I said matched the clarity I had reached. It proceeded exactly as it needed to, and he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the distinction without needing it explained, because men in his position understand the difference between expectation and necessity. And he continued, just enough to move the process forward. "If there have been any changes to your intentions, we can address them at your discretion." And there it was, the opening, not offered loudly, not presented as an option to be debated, but simply placed in front of me as a fact, and I felt that same calm settle deeper, not heavier, just more defined. Because the decision had already been made internally. This was simply the point at which it would begin to take shape externally, and I looked past him for a moment, toward the center of the room where Lauren was laughing at something Brian had just said, her hand resting lightly on his arm, completely at ease within the structure they had created. And I held that image for a second, not to dwell on it, but to confirm that nothing about it required immediate disruption. And then I returned my attention to Reeves, meeting his gaze with the same steadiness I had maintained all morning, and I said, quietly, without emphasis, "Yes, there have been changes." And he did not react, not outwardly, but I saw the slight shift in his posture, the readiness to proceed, and I knew that from this point forward, everything would move according to a different alignment, one that had been waiting beneath the surface. And as I lifted the glass of water to my lips, taking a small, unhurried sip, I understood that the real moment had not been the one at the front of the church. It was this one, here, in the quiet space between observation and action, where decisions are made without noise, and consequences begin long before anyone else is aware of them. Reeves did not ask for clarification, and that was the first confirmation that I had chosen the right person to stand at this particular intersection between intention and execution, because unnecessary questions slow down processes that are already understood, and he simply inclined his head once more, a subtle acknowledgement that the framework would now shift according to my direction, and he said, in the same measured tone, "Then I will prepare to implement the revised structure." And there was something precise in the way he chose that word, implement, not discuss, not reconsider, because he understood that what I was adjusting was not an emotional response. It was a structural correction, and I gave a small nod in return, not as permission, but as confirmation, and then I added, quietly, "The original trust will not be presented today," and for the first time, there was the slightest pause on his side, not hesitation, but recalibration, as if he were mentally adjusting the sequence of events that had been anticipated, and he responded without delay, "Understood. We will hold the documents in reserve." And I let that settle for a moment, feeling the alignment click into place, because this was the point where a path that had been moving in one direction for months had been deliberately redirected, and the simplicity of it was almost striking. Nothing had been taken away yet. Nothing had been announced, and still, everything had already changed. And I glanced again toward the center of the room, where the rhythm of the reception continued uninterrupted, Brian now engaged in conversation with a man who appeared to be discussing business, their body language slightly angled away from the family cluster, signaling a shift from personal celebration to professional positioning, and Lauren stood nearby, speaking with two women who nodded in agreement at something she had said, her expression confident, relaxed, fully integrated into the environment she had chosen, and I studied that for a moment, not to judge it, but to confirm that nothing in their behavior suggested awareness of what was unfolding just a few feet away, and that lack of awareness was not a flaw. It was simply a result of the narrative they were operating within, one that had been carefully constructed to exclude variables that did not fit. And I accepted that, because awareness is not something you can impose on others, it is something they encounter when the structure around them shifts. And Reeves spoke again, just enough to move the process forward. "Would you like the amendment to be executed immediately or scheduled for later delivery?" And the question was direct, but the implications were layered. Immediate execution would begin the process quietly, while delayed delivery would allow for a more visible point of impact. And I considered that for a brief moment, not because I was uncertain, but because timing, once again, mattered more than the action itself. And I thought about the sequence, the ceremony, the reception, the conversations still unfolding, the assumptions being reinforced in real time, and I understood that disruption, if introduced too early, would be dismissed as reaction, but if introduced at the right moment, it would be recognized as consequence. And I met his gaze again and said, "Prepare it now, but do not release it until after the reception concludes." And he nodded, the decision fitting cleanly into his framework. "Very well. The revised documents will be finalized and queued for distribution." And there was no need to elaborate further, because everything that needed to be understood had already been communicated, and I felt that same steady calm remain intact, not heightened, not diminished, just consistent. Because consistency is what allows decisions like this to carry weight without requiring force, and I shifted my attention back to the room, letting the moment with Reeves conclude naturally, without ceremony, without any visible sign that anything of significance had just occurred. and he stepped away as quietly as he had arrived, blending back into the periphery, while I remained where I was for a few seconds longer, finishing the last of the water in my glass, setting it down on the nearest table with a soft, controlled motion, and then I turned, not toward the exit, but toward the center of the room, beginning to move in that direction with the same unhurried pace I had maintained all morning, because there was still one more part of the sequence to complete, one that did not involve documents or legal structures, but something far more fundamental. And as I approached the cluster where Lauren stood, I noticed how the conversations adjusted slightly to accommodate my presence, not dramatically, not with any overt reaction, but with the subtle shifts that occur when someone enters a space they are not expected to occupy. And Lauren turned, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since the ceremony. And there was a brief flicker there, not quite recognition, not quite discomfort, just a momentary pause as she recalibrated how to respond, and she smiled, the same practiced expression she had offered to everyone else, and said, "Dad, you made it to the reception," as if the journey from the back of the church to this room had been an accomplishment in itself, and I returned the smile, not mirroring its intention, but acknowledging its presence, and I said, calmly, "Of course, I would not miss this." And the words were simple, neutral, but beneath them was a clarity that did not need to be spoken, because the real shift had already begun, and everything that followed would simply reveal what had been set in motion. Lauren's smile held for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to appear natural, short enough to move the interaction forward without inviting anything deeper, and I could see the calculation behind it now, not in a critical way, but in a precise one, the same way you recognize a pattern once you know what to look for. And Brian turned slightly as well, acknowledging me with a nod that was polite, measured, but distinctly different from the warmth he had shown others moments before, and he said, "Glad you could join us, Thomas," using my first name in a way that signaled familiarity without conceding position, and I returned the nod with the same level of restraint, because this was not a moment for correction, it was a moment for confirmation, and I said, "It is a beautiful event," allowing the statement to stand on its own without attaching anything to it. And Lauren glanced briefly toward the table where the gifts were being arranged, her eyes flicking to the bag I had placed earlier, and I noticed the subtle shift in her attention, the quick calculation of what that might represent, and she said, "You did not have to bring anything, Dad. We just wanted you here." And the phrasing was interesting, because it carried two meanings at once, one that sounded generous, and another that quietly redefined my role, and I let it pass without challenge, because challenging it would have required engaging with a definition I had already decided to revise, and instead, I said, calmly, "It is something I prepared some time ago," and I watched as that landed, not heavily, not dramatically, but enough to register, and Brian's posture adjusted slightly, his attention sharpening just a fraction, as if a new variable had entered the conversation, and Lauren's smile remained, but there was a brief tightening at the edges, a micro-expression that suggested curiosity edged with caution, and she said, "That is very thoughtful," and then, almost immediately, redirected the conversation towards someone approaching from the side, a woman greeting her with enthusiasm, effectively closing the exchange without acknowledging it fully, and I recognized the technique, not as avoidance, but as control, maintaining the flow of the room by limiting any deviation from the expected script, and I stepped back half a pace, allowing the new conversation to take priority, because forcing continuity where it was not welcomed would have been inefficient. And as I moved away from the center again, I felt no need to linger, no need to press the point, because the point had already been established internally and externally. The sequence was already in motion, and I returned to the side of the room, picking up a fresh glass of water from a passing tray, the cold surface grounding in a way that matched the clarity I had maintained throughout the morning, and I observed the room once more, noting how the energy had shifted slightly, not because of anything I had said, but because of the natural progression of events, people beginning to check their phones, small groups thinning as conversations reached their natural conclusions, the early signs that the reception was approaching its end, and I knew that this was the window I had been waiting for, not the peak of attention, but the moment just after, when focus begins to disperse and assumptions are at their strongest, because nothing appears to be changing. And that is precisely when change is most effective. And I glanced toward the entrance, where I could see Reeves again, now speaking quietly with a staff member near a small table that held event materials, his movements efficient, contained, not drawing attention, but completing tasks that would only be noticed later, and I understood that the revised structure was already taking form. Documents being finalized, notifications being prepared, processes aligning with the decision that had been made minutes earlier, and I felt no urgency to confirm it, because confirmation was not necessary when the system was functioning as intended, and instead, I allowed myself a final moment of observation, taking in the room as it existed now, the arrangement, the relationships, the assumptions, and I recognized it for what it was, a snapshot of a structure that was about to be tested, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through the quiet introduction of consequence. And I set the empty glass down, smoothing my jacket once more, the envelope still in place, no longer a gesture waiting to be given, but a reference point for what had already been redirected. And as I moved toward the exit, passing the table where the gift bag remained untouched, I did not pick it up, I did not draw attention to it, because its purpose had already changed. And I stepped into the hallway, the sound of the reception softening behind me. And I paused just long enough to check my watch, noting the time with the same precision I had applied to everything else that morning. Because timing is not just about when something happens, it is about ensuring that when it does, there is no confusion about why. And as I continued toward the doors, I knew that by the time the last guest left that room, the narrative they had been so careful to construct would begin to shift in ways they had not anticipated, not because I had disrupted it, but because I had allowed it to fully reveal itself before making a single adjustment. And that adjustment, once it reached them, would not require explanation, because the structure would speak for itself. By the time I stepped outside, the late morning air had shifted just enough to signal the beginning of the afternoon, the light slightly harsher, more direct, as if the day itself had moved past ceremony and into consequence. And I paused at the top of the steps, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to mark the transition, to recognize the point where observation had ended and execution had begun. And I took a slow breath, letting the sounds of the reception fade completely behind me, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional passing voice. And I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone with the same measured precision I had applied to everything else, and I checked the time again, confirming what I already knew, that the window I had defined was closing. And as if aligned with that exact moment, the device vibrated once, a quiet, controlled notification that carried more weight than anything that had been said inside that room. And I looked down at the screen, reading the message without any outward reaction: revised trust executed, distribution scheduled, and beneath it, a second line, equally concise: release in progress. And I let the words settle, not because they were unexpected, but because they marked the point where internal decisions became external realities. And I slipped the phone back into my pocket, not lingering on it, not rereading the message, because confirmation, once received, does not require repetition. And I descended the steps slowly, each movement deliberate, the rhythm steady, matching the clarity that had guided me from the moment I took that seat in the back of the church. And as I reached the sidewalk, I glanced once more at the entrance, the doors still closed, the activity inside continuing without interruption, and I understood that for them, nothing had changed yet. The narrative remained intact, the roles clearly defined, the assumptions reinforced, and that was exactly as it needed to be. Because consequence, when it arrives without warning, carries a different kind of weight, one that does not rely on explanation or confrontation. And I began to walk, not toward any specific destination, but simply away from the building, creating distance, both physical and symbolic. And as I moved, I allowed myself a brief reflection, not on the event itself, but on the pattern that had led to this point, the years of quiet support, the gradual shift in dynamics, the subtle redefinitions that had gone unchallenged until they solidified into something more permanent. And I recognized that what had happened today was not the cause. It was the confirmation, the visible expression of a structure that had already been formed, and correcting it required more than words. It required action that aligned with reality, and I felt no satisfaction in that. No sense of victory, just a steady acknowledgement that the adjustment had been necessary. And then, As I reached the corner, my phone vibrated again, a series of short, rapid notifications this time, and I did not need to look to understand what they were, because the sequence had been defined, the distribution initiated, and the first points of contact would now be receiving information that did not match their expectations. And I imagined the moment inside, not in detail, but in structure, the subtle shift as someone checked a phone, the slight pause in conversation, the quiet exchange of glances, the first questions forming before anyone had the full context. And I knew that the initial response would not be clarity, it would be confusion, because the narrative they had been operating within did not account for this variable, and confusion, when left unresolved, quickly transforms into something else. And I continued walking, maintaining the same pace, the same composure, because there was nothing left for me to do in that moment. The process was already in motion, and interference would only disrupt the precision of what had been set. And as I reached my car, I paused again, one hand resting lightly on the door, and I looked back once more, not at the building itself, but at the space it occupied in my understanding, and I realized that this was the final adjustment, not just to the trust, but to the relationship it had represented, a shift from assumption to clarity, from unspoken expectation to defined reality. And I opened the door, sliding into the driver's seat with the same quiet control, closing it behind me, sealing out the outside noise. And as I placed the key in the ignition, I allowed myself one final thought, not about what would happen next, but about what had already been established, that dignity is not something granted by position or proximity. It is something maintained through clarity and action. And as the engine started, the sound low and steady, I pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a room full of people who believed they understood the structure they were standing in, unaware that the foundation beneath them had just been fundamentally redefined. The drive was quiet, not in the sense of absence, but in the sense of completion, the kind of silence that follows a decision that no longer requires review. And I kept my eyes on the road, the steady lines of traffic moving with predictable rhythm, each vehicle maintaining its lane, its speed, its direction, and I found something fitting in that, because systems, when they function correctly, do not require constant correction. They operate according to the structures set in place, and I had just adjusted one of those structures, not abruptly, not recklessly, but with the same measured intent that had defined every step of the process. And as I drove, my phone remained face down on the passenger seat, vibrating intermittently, a series of notifications that I did not need to check immediately, because their content was already understood, the sequence had been initiated, the distribution completed, and the responses would now follow their own predictable pattern. First confusion, then verification, then reaction, and I allowed that process to unfold without interference, because interference would have introduced noise into something that required clarity, and clarity, once established, is best maintained through consistency. And I turned onto a quieter street, the traffic thinning, the surroundings shifting from commercial to residential, and I felt the pace of the environment adjust accordingly, slower, more contained, and I reduced my speed slightly, not out of necessity, but out of alignment, matching the rhythm of the space I had entered. And after a few minutes, I pulled into the driveway of a small property I had kept for years, not as a retreat, not as a statement, but as a place that existed outside the expectations of anyone else, a place defined only by its function. And I turned off the engine, the sudden stillness settling around me. And for a moment, I remained there, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not reflecting, not reconsidering, just acknowledging the transition from movement to stillness. And then I reached for the phone, turning it over, the screen lighting up immediately, a list of notifications waiting, and I scanned them without urgency, not reading each one in detail, but noting the sources: Lauren, Brian, an unfamiliar number likely associated with his family, a second message from Reeves confirming completion, and a few missed calls layered between them, the pattern exactly as expected. And I opened Lauren's message first, not because it held priority, but because it represented the most direct point of contact, and the words were brief, controlled, but carrying a tension that had not been present earlier. Dad, what is this about the trust? We just received something from a law office. And I read it once, then again, not for comprehension, but for tone, and I saw the shift immediately, the absence of assumption, replaced by uncertainty. The first indication that the narrative she had been operating within no longer aligned with the information in front of her, and I did not respond, not immediately, because response, at this stage, would have served to explain something that needed to be understood without assistance, and I moved to the next message, Brian's, shorter, more direct. Thomas, we need to talk. And there was a difference in that phrasing, less controlled, more reactive, a subtle indication that the structure he relied on had been disrupted in a way he had not anticipated. And I set the phone down on the center console, not dismissing the messages, but placing them in sequence, allowing them to exist as part of the process rather than something to be addressed individually. And I stepped out of the car, the air outside still, the faint sound of leaves moving in the distance, and I walked toward the front door, unlocking it with a familiar motion, stepping inside to a space that required nothing from me beyond presence. And I closed the door behind me, the sound soft but final, and as I moved into the room, I set the phone down on the table near the entrance, not silencing it, not turning it off, just placing it where it could continue to receive whatever came next, because what came next no longer required my immediate input. The structure had been defined, the adjustment made, and now it would reveal itself through the responses of those who had built their expectations on something that no longer existed. And I walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same steady rhythm of movement continuing beyond the glass. And I understood that while their world had just shifted, mine had simply realigned, returning to a clarity that had been obscured for too long. And I stood there for a moment, not waiting, not anticipating, just present in the outcome I had chosen. Because the most important part of any decision is not the action itself. It is the willingness to let it stand without apology, without revision, and without the need to justify it to those who only recognized its value after it was no longer available. The phone rang again, this time not a vibration against a surface, but a direct interruption, the sound cutting through the quiet of the room with a persistence that suggested urgency rather than curiosity. And I did not move toward it immediately, not because I was ignoring it, but because timing still mattered, even now, perhaps especially now. And I let it ring twice more before walking back to the table, my steps measured, unhurried, and I glanced at the screen before answering, confirming what I already knew, Lauren. And I let it ring one last time before pressing accept, lifting the phone to my ear without speaking first, because silence, at the beginning of a conversation like this, often reveals more than any opening statement. And for a second, there was nothing on the other end, just the faint sound of movement, of breath being controlled, and then her voice came through, no longer calibrated for an audience, no longer aligned with presentation, but edged with something else, something closer to confusion than anger. Dad, I do not understand what is happening. And I leaned lightly against the edge of the table, not to support myself, but to settle into the moment, and I said, calmly, you received the documents. And it was not a question, it was a confirmation, and there was a pause, longer this time, as if she were recalibrating the conversation in real time. Yes, but it says the education trust is not being activated. It says it has been restructured with conditions that we were never told about. And I could hear the shift in her tone, the movement from confusion towards something more defined, a search for footing in a situation that no longer matched her expectations. And I let a brief silence follow, not to create tension, but to allow the words to settle into their proper context. And then I said, the structure was always conditional. And there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, not dramatic, but enough to register. And she responded quickly, that is not what we discussed. You said you were setting something up for Ethan. And I noted the phrasing again, not incorrect, but incomplete, and I replied, evenly. I said I was preparing something for his future, and I did. And the distinction hung there, subtle but precise, and I could almost hear her processing it, aligning what she remembered with what was now in front of her. And then Brian's voice entered the call, not directly, but in the background at first, a low murmur, then closer, more direct, put me on speaker, and there was a brief shuffle, a shift in sound, and then his voice came through clearly, controlled, but carrying a tighter edge than before. Thomas, we need to understand why this was changed without any discussion. And I listened to the wording carefully, the emphasis on need, on understand, on discussion, and I recognized the structure of the question. Not just seeking information, but but attempting to re-establish a position. And I responded without raising my voice, without altering my tone. It was changed because the context changed. And there was a pause, shorter this time, but heavier, as if the simplicity of the answer did not provide the foothold they were expecting, and Brian spoke again, more directly now. What context are you referring to? And I allowed myself a brief glance toward the window, the light outside steady, unchanged, and I said, the context of how I am positioned in this family. And the words were clear, not accusatory, not emotional, just defined, and there was silence on the line, not empty, but filled with the weight of recognition, and Lauren spoke again, her voice quieter now, less certain. Dad, that was just seeding. It was not meant to be a big deal. And I closed my eyes for a second, not out of frustration, but to align the response with the clarity I had maintained all along, and I said, it was not about the seat, and I let that settle before continuing. It was about the definition that came with it, and I could hear the shift again, the movement from dismissal toward consideration, and Brian attempted to redirect. You are overreacting to a misunderstanding. This is not something that should affect Ethan's future, and I noted the return to framing, to narrowing the focus, and I responded, evenly. Ethan's future is exactly why the structure exists, and there was no need to elaborate further, because the logic was already complete, and I let the silence return, not forcing the next step, allowing them to reach for it. And after a few seconds, Lauren said, more softly now, so what happens now? And I looked at the phone for a moment, not because I needed to, but because the question marked the transition from reaction to consequence, and I answered with the same calm precision that had guided everything up to this point. Now, the conditions will determine what is available, and I did not expand on it. Did not list those conditions, because understanding them would require reflection, not explanation, and I could hear the shift on the other end, the realization that this was not a negotiation, not a discussion to be managed, but a structure already in place, and I let that realization stand without interference, because clarity, once established, does not need reinforcement, it simply needs to be allowed to exist. There was a shift on the line after I spoke, not immediate, not loud, but unmistakable, the kind of shift that happens when a conversation moves from expectation into realization, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke, and I could hear it in the silence, the recalibration, the quiet attempt to find a position that no longer existed in the same way. And then Lauren's voice came back, softer now, less certain. Dad, we did not mean anything by it, you know that, right? And I let that sit. For a moment, not because I needed time to respond, but because the statement itself required space to reveal what it actually was, not an explanation, not an acknowledgement, but an attempt to minimize something that had already been clearly defined, and I said, evenly. Intent does not change structure, and I could hear the weight of that land, not harshly, but firmly, and Brian spoke again, his tone more controlled now, but with a layer of urgency beneath it. Then what exactly are these conditions? Because the document is not clear on how this gets restored, and I recognize the direction immediately. The attempt to move from consequence back into solution, to frame the situation as something that could be navigated rather than understood, and I replied without shifting tone. The conditions are clear, they are tied to conduct and alignment, and I did not elaborate, because elaboration would have reduced the necessity of interpretation, and interpretation was precisely what they needed to engage with. And there was a pause again, longer this time, and I could hear movement in the background, voices, the reception still in progress, but now layered with something else, tension that had not been present before, and Lauren spoke again, more directly. So you are saying this is because of what happened today, and I looked toward the window again, the same steady light, the same unchanged environment, and I said, I am saying today made it visible, and there was no need to raise my voice, no need to emphasize the point, because the distinction was already complete, and I could feel the conversation shifting again, moving away from denial, away from dismissal, towards something closer to recognition, and Brian responded, slower now, choosing his words more carefully. If this is about perception, then we can address that. We can make adjustments going forward. And I almost smiled at the phrasing, not out of amusement, but because it confirmed exactly what I had already understood. that he was still operating within a framework of control, of management, of future positioning, and I said, calmly, "This is not about future adjustments," and I let that settle before continuing. "It is about present clarity," and the words held their place, not expanding, not contracting, simply existing as they were. And there was silence again, but this time it was different, not searching, not reactive, but absorbing. And I knew that this was the moment where the structure had fully revealed itself to them, not through explanation, but through contrast between what they had assumed and what now existed. And Lauren's voice came through once more, quieter than before. "Dad, we did not think it mattered that much." And I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement of the distance between perspectives, and I said, "That is exactly why it does." And I did not add anything to it, because anything more would have diluted the precision of the statement. And I could hear her breathing on the other end, the slight irregularity that comes when someone is trying to process something that does not fit into their previous understanding. And Brian did not speak immediately this time, which in itself was a shift, and when he did, his tone was different, less assertive, more measured. "What would you need to see for this to change?" And I recognized the question for what it was, not a challenge, but an attempt to identify parameters, and I responded without hesitation, "Consistency." And I let the single word stand, not expanding it, not defining it further, because its meaning was already embedded in everything that had led to this point. And there was no immediate response, just a quiet pause that stretched a few seconds longer than before, and then Lauren said, softly, "We will call you later." And I heard something in that, not resolution, not agreement, but a shift away from immediate reaction towards something that required time, and I said, simply, "Take your time." And I ended the call without waiting for anything further, because the conversation had reached its natural conclusion, and as I set the phone down on the table again, I felt no change in the clarity I had maintained. No second thoughts, no reconsideration. Just a steady awareness that what had been set in motion was now doing exactly what it was meant to do. Not punish, not retaliate, but reveal. And once something is revealed clearly enough, it no longer requires force to be understood. It simply requires the willingness to see it for what it is. The house remained quiet long after the call ended, the kind of quiet that does not feel empty but settled, as if everything inside it had already found its place without needing adjustment. And I stayed by the window for a while, not watching anything in particular, just allowing the stillness to hold. Because stillness, when it follows clarity, is not absence, it is confirmation. And I thought about the sequence of the day, not as a series of events, but as a structure that had revealed itself layer by layer, from the moment I was asked to sit in the back, to the moment I chose not to correct it, to the point where that decision carried forward into something far more defining. And I understood now that nothing I had done required explanation beyond what had already been shown, because explanation is often used to soften reality, and I had no interest in softening something that needed to remain precise. And as the afternoon light shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the floor, I walked back toward the table, picking up my phone once more, not to check for messages, but simply to move it, placing it in a drawer and closing it without hesitation, because whatever came next would not be decided through immediate response. It would be shaped over time, through the same consistency I had already defined, and I moved through the house slowly, each step familiar, each space unchanged. And I realized that while their understanding of me had shifted today, mine had simply returned to something I had always known but allowed to blur. That value is not determined by proximity, by where you are asked to sit, or how you are acknowledged in a room. It is defined by the structures you build and the standards you maintain. And I paused in the hallway, one hand resting lightly against the wall, feeling the solid surface beneath my fingers. A simple reminder that strength is not always visible, but it is always present when it has been built correctly. And I thought about Ethan, not as a symbol, not as a point in the conversation, but as a child who would grow into whatever environment was consistently presented to him. And I felt no regret about the decision I had made, because it was not about removing something from him. It was about ensuring that what remained would be grounded in something real, something earned, something aligned with the kind of foundation that does not shift when pressure is applied. And I turned toward the living room, sitting down in a chair that faced the window, the same steady light now softer, more even, and I let my hands rest loosely in my lap. The tension of the day fully resolved into something simpler, something quieter, and I understood that the conversation earlier had not been the end. It had been the beginning of a different kind of understanding. One that would not be immediate, one that would not be comfortable, but one that would be clear if they chose to see it. And I was prepared for whatever pace that required, because clarity does not depend on agreement. It depends on consistency. And as I sat there, the room still, the world outside moving at its own rhythm, I allowed myself one final thought, not about what they would say next, not about how they would respond, but about the structure that now existed, unchanged by opinion, unaffected by reaction. And I said it quietly, not as a declaration, but as a simple acknowledgement of what had been set in place. They did not move me to the back. They removed themselves from everything that came after.